Hi, I'm Doug Atkinson here at Solutions Review, and we couldn't be happier to host the 4th annual Insight Jam. I want to thank everyone who's participating this week, as well as our Insight Jam sponsors, DataStax, Monte Carlo, Denodo, High Gear, and Seller Data. I also want to thank our Solutions Review editors and staff for pulling this event together. When we started this in 2019, we wanted to take a moment at the end of the year to celebrate enterprise technology with a social media event offering best practices and predictions. This will be our biggest jam ever, including 16 live-streamed expert panel discussions over 4 days. And we intend to keep the insights flowing in 2023 with the launch of an expert subscription site for any tech professional who wants to publish posts on Solutions Review. Again, thank you all for being here and enjoy the Insight Jam.
Solutions Review presents Insight Jam, a social media celebration of enterprise technology. Hello and welcome to the 4th annual Insight Jam. My name is Jonathan Paula. Pleased to have you with us for our first panel of 16 this week. Adapting and managing IAM, Endpoint, and SIEM in the SaaS age. We have an esteemed group of experts joining me this morning. Starting off from my right, Ram, Wayne, Kimberly, Mark, David, and Mark. Thank you all for being with us. Really excited to get this panel started. So to set expectations for the next 58 minutes or so, we're going to discuss this topic at hand. I hope everyone gets a chance to get each of their points in. So to kind of keep the time, 60 seconds or so per answer, 30 seconds for any follow-ups. We'll start with some introductions. Ram, our moderator, lets you have us go first.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for this panel discussion at Insight Jam. My name is Ram Vaidyanathan, and I'm a cybersecurity technology specialist and product marketing manager at ManageEngine. And I'll be the moderator for this discussion. So anyways, today we have an amazing panel on adapting and managing IAM, Endpoint, and SIEM in the SaaS age. We'll be talking about cybersecurity and identity and access management in the year 2023 and beyond, as we all warm up to an increasingly SaaS and cloud environment. This is very relevant because according to Gartner, the SaaS industry is worth $172 billion currently. Therefore, the security-related decisions you take on this front will certainly impact your business. At the end of this session today, we hope that you take away some new perspectives and that you can implement and create tangible value for your business. Great, so now it's time for introductions. Let's start with Wayne.
Hi, I'm Wayne Doris. I'm the Business Development Manager for Cybersecurity for the Americas for Access Communications. In my role, I set strategy for what gets developed to push into research and development in Sweden and help outline for our products kind of a roadmap of what we need, and particularly as the landscape changes for identity and access management and integration into cloud and to SIEM and source systems.
Good afternoon, good morning, good evening perhaps. My name is Mark Gazzetta. I lead product as our Chief Product Officer at Axiomatics. I've had the pleasure of being in InfoSec for the past decade or so. Today focus a lot of my time and effort on driving strategy around authorization and attribute-based access control as it relates to zero trust strategies for our customers. So great to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Amazing. Thanks for that, Mark. Hello, Kimberly. Could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, sure thing. So happy to be here today. Kimberly Biddings, I'm VP of Product at BioKey International. Have also been at this a little over a decade or so, and been in every kind of area, including certificate authorities to healthcare IAM to security ratings. Now at BioKey, I really focus on helping customers understand identity and access management, how to implement key controls such as multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, and starting to really evangelize this concept of having trust between people in the digital environment that we're in. So really excited for today's discussion and happy to be here.
Nice having you here with us, Kimberly. Next up, we have one more Mark on the panel. Mark Alba, you're up next. Please go ahead.
Hi, Ron. Thanks. My name is Mark Alba. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Anomaly. My focus in my 2 decades worth of cybersecurity has really been around how do we secure the cloud? How do we understand attackers? And how do we allow security operations centers to better monitor and detect attackers, and understand their attack surface. Really excited about today's conversation, especially with all of the insight that's coming in from the identity folks, and look forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks, Mark. And last but not the least, we've got David here with us. David, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ram. So, hi everyone. I'm David, the co-founder and CTO at Solvo. I have over 16 years of experience in enterprise software development. I've been in the cloud security domain for the past 8 years. About 2.5 years ago, I co-founded Solvo, and in Solvo, we are developing tools to automate cloud security.
Great, thank you so much for that, David. A diverse set of people here. This is going to be exciting. So first up, let's start with the most fundamental question. That's probably on everyone's mind. So when we talk about the fast uptake of the cloud and how more than 90% of organizations globally are on multi-cloud environments, we cannot neglect the vulnerabilities that come with the territory. Yes, the cloud is super great. No one can deny it. It can save costs and make an organization much more agile. But there are security challenges. So David, maybe we can start with you. What do you think are the vulnerabilities of the cloud?
So first, you need to, the first challenge you need is to select the right cloud service. And then after you're selecting the right cloud service, you need to configure it to meet the application requirements and also to maintain high security standards. So let's say you're about to develop a new cloud application, and this cloud application needs a data storage. So you can select one of the popular storage services. It might be an RDS, S3, DynamoDB, or other service. And let's say you decided to use DynamoDB as a storage. So now you need to understand how you can control access and how to make sure what identities or the right identities can access it. This is a challenging task. So you need a deep understanding in the specific service in order to maintain these high security standards. So this is part of the, as I see it, the main challenges when you start to develop a new SaaS application.
Right. And Mark Alba, would you like to add anything to what David just said?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. And finding the right service provider. The other thing that we often encounter, specifically as we're talking to SOCs and IT shops, is this assumption that if I'm outsourcing to the cloud, I'm outsourcing everything to the cloud, and that's a complete fallacy. I think understanding that, number one, a lot of the software that's running in the cloud are common off-the-shelf software solutions that have the vulnerabilities that you would expect with your enterprise software. So as a security operations team, understanding that it's part of your attack surface and that you need to account for it, even though it's being hosted by a third party. The other thing that I think is huge, especially if you've been to some of the security shows over the last year, is API security. A lot of being in the cloud is leveraging very powerful APIs, but those APIs become vulnerabilities for attackers, vulnerabilities that are exposed by attackers.
Great, thanks, Mark. And a lot of the stuff that we see at our company and the customers that I talk to, well, data exfiltration into the cloud is also becoming a huge challenge. It's where, especially during the pandemic, a lot of people started using third-party SaaS applications, and the visibility was just not there, and data could leak into the cloud. So that is another big challenge that we are seeing. So yeah, some good insights, guys. Now, going to Wayne, I know that you do a lot of work around this area. A big challenge that many IT teams face has to do with securing IoT endpoints, and at the same time, also working with cloud applications. What are the challenges here, Wayne, when you're dealing with IoT and cloud?
Yeah, thank you. I actually call IoT endpoints, they're kind of the gold mine, and they're also the landmine, right? So we're out at the edge where you want all this data, which you want to aggregate up into the cloud or federate up there. And it allows us a lot of opportunity when we do that. Cloud applications have allowed us to add more analytics, get more insight to what's going on. But for a traditional IoT device, such as an IP camera, which we manufacture, it is not as easy. I'll give an example, right? So we're running usually custom embedded Linux, so we're not running a full stack of Debian or something that you could easily run an agent on, which would make that process be far more transparent to other systems. Even something as simple as we know that if we're going to connect to the cloud, it's going to be encrypted. Certificate management for IoT devices is not a standard thing for the most part, meaning that finding IoT devices that traditionally integrate to Active Directory or whatever other identity access management you're working with, not so simple. It's also pushed us to develop other technologies, particularly when we work with our cloud platforms. We've developed secure communications through a one-click. In other words, we find that the implementer would be very difficult, so they would have to set up all these different rules, push through these different firewalls. And so we actually have technology that allows one click, and it'll easily enroll up to the cloud platform. So it's really pushed us, but you do have to secure that endpoint at the end of the day. Otherwise, your whole security, cybersecurity for the whole organization isn't viable.
That actually got me curious. You spoke about the IP cameras that you manufacture.
Mm-hmm.
So let's say that there's an organization who uses a SIEM solution, and they get visibility of everything that's there in their network. So how exactly do your IP cameras integrate? How do they get visibility on that?
Yeah, that's very difficult. Right now, you kind of have to do custom integrations, whether it's, to Splunk or ArcSight or whatever it is, right? Also, one of the things I've been really pushing, when we've looked at our syslogs, for the most part, they were good for our own understanding or, troubleshooting of the device. They weren't really developed for, oh, hey, we need to provide information to a SIEM or a source system to say, what's the behavior of the device? Has it changed? Has somebody been trying to brute force into it? These are things, even though they've had capabilities, were they actually in the log? So trying to expand so that our devices are providing valuable, useful information from a cybersecurity standpoint into these other systems so that the endpoint can be protected like you would any traditional laptop or desktop server.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Yeah, I was gonna, Ram, I was just gonna chime in too. So, I think both these subjects we've already started to touch upon push boundaries of what traditional identity has been and traditional boundaries of business has been. And then you threw gasoline on the fire with COVID, right? So when we look at cloud, my favorite question from a baseline with cloud is, well, where does my security responsibility start and stop? And where does, the actual provider start and stop from a security perspective? And saw that a lot in the risk assessment that organizations were trying to do. And then Wayne, to your point, the IoT challenges that even more because a traditional identity, as we've defined it as identity professionals, is challenged when you have a low compute endpoint or something that actually can't handle, a full identity kind of interaction as we know it. I remember in certificate authority days, we were trying to figure out how to embed certs at the point of manufacturing because that was really your only opportunity. So I just want to bring the point. These are things that are fundamentally challenging how security professionals and identity professionals have looked at these things for decades. And so I think, just a valuable point to point out that it's not like everybody out there has figured it out. That's the other part I've noticed very readily with most folks. So,
yeah, and I guess it's great points, Kimberly and Ram. If I can just jump in on that, I think your point about gasoline on the fire is spot on. And there's a couple of key things, at least I've seen that have driven that. One, you've got, what's the point of why are organizations shifting to the cloud? Well, it's for speed, it's for agility, it's for innovation. And if you look at it, that can sometimes be counter, of course, to what's happening in security, right? In security, we're trying to put the right guardrails around things, but still allow the business to go faster. So all of a sudden, you've got this compounding effect and this transformation that security seemingly had to make overnight, and realizing that it's not just a little shift in how they're doing things, it's a paradigm shift to principles like zero trust and strategies around zero trust. And on top of that, the business is still looking to go faster, and the complexity in a positive way, right? The cloud is is a wonderful thing, but all of a sudden your architecture and your application development strategy is completely changed. You're now, you're not looking at a monolithic architecture. You're now looking at a microservices architecture where I think the comment was already made about APIs. Well, now you don't just have one decision point for policy. You might have 30 or 40 different decision points for policy. So I think that's been sort of a absolutely kind of compounding effect of some of the challenges. And then you add the vulnerabilities on top of it, and that's kind of where we're at today.
Right. And coming back to Kimberly, you spoke about identities and the pressing need to manage identities. In fact, it's probably really critical for people to have identity as a center of security. So, what are the best ways for organizations to create and authenticate identities, in your opinion?
Yeah, so starting with creation of identities, I think that's a tricky subject and has become trickier, right? Because you're not doing in-person activities, you're all digital. What we're seeing is really kind of two things. It's more of kind of identity affirmation than full identity proofing. And that goes really to what's the level of assurance you have to have. I tell people with security, look, you have to make it appropriate to the risk right now, being on both sides. And so the first challenge for folks is now in a cloud environment where people aren't in front of you. Let's say higher ed, right? We see it all the time. There are no on-campus engagement with a student. How do you prove what they're actually doing is who they say they are, and that from that perspective? And we're seeing huge amounts of fraud, right, in that area because of that. But when it comes to creating the identity, I think people have to really consider how far do you need to go? Is a selfie, plus an identity matching to that photograph, for example, is that enough? Or do you actually need that full vetting team, as we've done in certificates for decades, to verify the person is who they say they are? On the next side of things, when you're authenticating that identity, I'm somewhat shocked at how much we are still standardizing on devices and tokens, right? And it's no longer a part about, are you implementing the right IAM control? Now these hackers and the bad guys, or the 18-year-old in some cases, is actually going after our identity technology, right? They're going after the IAM, the PAM, the IGA solutions that are out there. And so the other thing I tell folks is you have to also think about the risk when someone's logging in, but you also want to think about where the trust is established. Zero trust is now a buzzword, and not even buzzword, right? Standard framework from NIST. It's implemented, it's recommended. But I think the key word there is trust, and what are you actually trusting at the end of the day? So it's interesting for me. I think people need to start really considering and understanding full authentication. It's not just about the first action that person takes and logs in. There's session management, right? There's encryption. There's how that authentication gets transferred and confirmed on the other side. So definitely people need to think about offsetting risk plus that security liability that they have. How do you implement that in an effective way?
That's
and
interesting.
also I want to,
yeah.
And also about this, and also as Mark mentioned today, the platform looks a bit much different. You have many more components and microservices, and they have their own identities, and you need to manage all this and try to understand who actually can access what, or what actions can be performed on by which microservice, and this becoming more and more challenging.
Yeah,
today.
that's a great point, by the way, David. I just want to chime in because I don't think people have an appreciation that who I am to one service is captured differently in the next, is captured differently in the right. And so what happens is, how do you consolidate? How do you aggregate identity? We don't probably have time to dig into decentralized identity. It's probably a broad subject for all of us. But again, the problem is that I may be Kim.Biddings to one, I may be Kimberly.B to another, I might be verified by a completely different metric. And so a lot of situations, especially in the United States, I think Europe has some national ID advantages, but that's a huge struggle, is across cloud services. How do you uniquely identify somebody consistently with all these variations of their identity? So it's fascinating.
Yeah, I was just going to ask that actually. So how do you do that? This is for everyone in the panel. Anyone wants to chime in? Like, how exactly do you do that? There could be cases of credential switching. There could come in as somebody in one application, then suddenly they move on to some other machine under some other identity. How do you get the full view of everything? How do you actually do this?
There's the question of identity of who you are, and then there's the question of your permissions and entitlements. So how do you all of a sudden, so it's great. I've hopefully authenticated who you are, but then it's okay, well, what can you actually do in these applications, and how does that context change based on the application or the service that you're looking to access? And I think that the key thing that has to, and I'll talk more at a strategy level, but so whether it's on the authentication side or whether it's on the authorization side, is we're seeing this movement in the enterprise shifting from to sort of centralize the strategy of authentication, of authorization, while still being able to decentralize the creation of policy, so that you're not becoming, so that security and IAM are not becoming the bottleneck. So what that fundamentally means is we're seeing, not just these individual application teams go out and build their own identity strategy. They're effectively having to work with a central team to align on what that looks like, so that they don't have all these different islands of identity within the organization. And so I'm kind of answering it more at a strategy level, because I think that's kind of the first step. And then technically, how do you do that? I mean, there's a whole variety of ways of how that can be instantiated, but I think that's the first key thing that has to happen.
Now, Mark Alba, coming to you, what's your take on this? I mean, we've got Kimberly speaking about effective IAM. We also have them talking about zero trust. So could you give an idea to us about how you get started with a zero trust strategy? How can you go about implementing it?
Yeah, listen, for me, and our focus really is on the attacker and the intelligence that drives the definition of the attack. I think what's really interesting with zero trust, and we follow it very closely. Wayne mentioned this before when he was talking about IoT, when he was talking about all the devices that are out there and the access to the device. I think the important thing is visibility. When we talk about establishing an identity, Kimberly spoke to this very well, identities change. And not only do the identities change, but what they're trying to access changes. So for example, you can have a finance server which has some very valuable data. You're going through an M&A transaction, and all of a sudden it becomes even more valuable. The people that had access to that data may have had least privileged rights access to start with, but there's been a change. The other thing to look at is you think about the security of that particular asset and the changing dynamic of the asset is, who are the attackers that would go after it? If I'm a security engineer, I'm working with my IT organization using that M&A use case. I'm expanding my attack surface by adding additional servers. Am I also looking at identity or access to those servers based off of who are the attackers that are going to try to get those servers? So all these things come into play, and it becomes, and I would argue that at least with a lot of the SOCs that I speak with, the identity teams oftentimes aren't speaking enough to the threat detection and response teams. And I think that lack of communication makes the security posture that you need to have in place, which should be dynamic, it really makes it less dynamic than it should be. And in some cases, with some organizations, that dynamic becomes static.
Right, Mark.
Yeah, I would say I'll give two words that I see come to mind. One is continuous, which is, Mark, what you just kind of hit upon, right? It's not enough to authenticate once and then allow these permissions to just persist. And contextual, right? Where it's becoming less about the factors and the situation. You have to pull in the context of when that access is being given, and then on a continuous basis, continuing to evaluate that. Now, the interesting thing is most of the organizations I'm talking to, even extremely large enterprises, are on 101, like step 101. Some haven't even implemented multi-factor authentication, for example. And so anyone listening out there, I also always give the advice of please at least start somewhere, right? With the foundation.
Start with the basics.
Yeah, start with the basics, please, but I think that's where we're going to have to get to, because every front door is essentially vulnerable at this point. So,
and I think, just keying off that, Kimberly and Mark, that's why we're seeing the rise of ITDR, right? Mm-hmm. So identity threat detection and response. And I had this conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago. Threat detection and response isn't a new concept, right? This has been around, certainly at the SOC level, at the network level for decades. I mean, it's obviously evolved. The data exists, right? These enterprises have all got the data. The question is now, how do we, from the identity side, make sure it's being used at every single transaction or authentication level and authorization level. And I think that is really the evolution of the market. Now, Kimberly, to your point, if they don't have some of the basics in place, well, let's get that figured out. But this is absolutely the next step.
Yeah, I mean, some of it gets very difficult. Like I get a lot of requests for two-factor authentication for a camera. Well, it makes sense if you have a handful of cameras. If you have an organization that has 10,000 or 100,000 cameras, two-factor authentication every time you want to see a stream, it gets kind of not probably the best practice that you want to do, right? You want to do that on the platform and say, yeah, we've consolidated this and you have access, to that. I can say from identity management, it's pushed us, as Kim had mentioned earlier, to do it at the production process. So we tie our CA identity at the time of production to the secure element or the trusted platform module that goes onto the device for that. And we're also exploring, as we know, there's more and more devices, right? I think at last count, we're about 50 billion devices, and we know that number is just going to increase. So automation of having this identity to say, okay, you're this kind of device, you need these kinds of services, whether it's through the use of Brewski or MUD protocols to say, hey, I understand what you are. We put you on a provisional VLAN. I want to actually assign another identity that for this organization to you as well, and then move you on to your production environment, right? That's kind of the ultimate goal that we see, that there's just too many devices, and having to set up all these rules, there has to be more interaction, or I should say more automation, and it requires a lot of work, particularly on my side of the fence as a endpoint manufacturer, to be able to fit all of these different topologies, whether it's zero trust or whatever it is we're implementing. It gets challenging, but we're trying to do that.
And there were a couple of keywords I think being spoken over here. We had dynamic security. We also had the word continuous. So are we hinting at some sort of a risk-based analysis or risk-based cybersecurity? Is that what we are talking about here?
I have a lot of discussions with CISOs, and inevitably that discussion goes back up to the CEOs and the boards. And I think in this macro environment now, it becomes an investment decision and a budget decision. I think all of the decisions that need to be made in security have to be risk-based. We're talking a lot about, and Wayne's bringing in probably the most interesting problem of IoT, the amount of telemetry that's out there that could allow us to make a decision. And so I think everything needs to be risk-based, but it needs to be risk-based based off of not only, as I mentioned earlier, the risk to the asset and the changing risks to the asset, but what's the risk of what's happening with the attack environment? What is my threat landscape? Who are the attackers that could potentially attack me? And how do I apply that to the risk to my environment? Again, we're now talking about the dynamic nature of bringing this all together. The simplest way to do it, I've seen within a SOC, is to move. We talked about threat detection and response. To move from threat detection being a question of how do I bring in all this information and monitor for specific threats, whether it's an insider threat or it's an external threat, but how do I bring all this information together, ask the questions that I need to ask about a specific attack. I am worried about an insider attack, so I'm going to look for that data. I am worried about an external threat or a threat to my cloud services. How do I look for that? And that allows you to bring in a massive amount of data and then very quickly pinpoint to look for the specific threat to your environment. And that to me is more of a risk-based approach to securing your environment.
So I agree completely with you, Mark. And I think what you mentioned, Mark and Wayne, is the combination of the two top factors of the future security tools. So Wayne is talking about automation, how automation is important. If you have thousands or tens of thousands of assets you need to manage, and Mark, you are talking about the priority, how exactly this risk affects my crowd jewel data in my environment. So the combination of the two will allow me to focus on what's important, has the most impact on my security posture, and do it automatically and fast and scale. And at scale.
Yeah, and I would say the risk side, where I see the worst investments made is where the risk has not been assessed. So, or my favorite is if you ask somebody, okay, well, why are you implementing this control? And they say, well, obviously to remove this set of risks, and it's not matched. It's actually, you know, for any C-level out there who's managing a budget, bad investment comes from lack of risk assessment to assess why you need that in the first place. And there's oftentimes, well, this is going to prevent all account takeovers. Well, no, that method actually doesn't prevent account takeovers, and you're going to have a one-off siloed solution. So that's critical for not only protecting the organization and being effective at security, but it's also essential for proper resource allocation and budget allocation at the end of the day.
The idea of risk-based insert data protection identity, it's been around for more than a decade, and we saw it with the rise of user behavioral analytics solutions back in 2011, 2012. I mean, I think it felt like I thought what maybe it was RSA 2013. It was like every vendor was a UBA, and then that they all kind of they didn't disappear. They either got acquired or whatnot. So these big platforms are kind of baking that idea of risk and analytics into their solutions. The question is, what are we doing with it? And I think that the issue is there's been a lot of focus on threat detection, and the really hard part is how do I connect that to a response? But how do I connect that to a response in a way that's scalable, right? So it's one thing for, you know, to have security analysts in a SOC trying to kind of manage this themselves a one-off, but if we're talking to a 50,000 person organization, how do you automate that? Now, there's been tools to try to do that, but that's still a lot of the challenge. So I think that's where it's really about how are we going to connect those threat detections and that risk information to an actual enforcement point as you're developing your applications, as you're developing your identity strategies, as you're developing your data protection strategy. And so I think it's an exciting time, but anything risk-based is really the promised land that security's been looking to achieve for more than a decade now, but we're definitely getting closer.
And I think, you know, some of the changes, and you know, David mentioned this with, you know, just the amount of the amount of assets that you're trying to protect and how do you prioritize on them. I think what I'm seeing as a change is that, you know, again, coming from the intelligence side, we're tracking billions and billions of attacks or billions evidence of attack within an environment on a continuous basis. If I were to go to any CISO and say, hey, I'm going to help you track billions of attacks on a continuous basis, if I were the CISO, I'd stick my head in the sand. And I would say, I don't even want to deal with that. I think what we're seeing, Mark, is that we're moving beyond just things like UEBA, which very powerful tools. They allow you to understand the anomalies of a user and an entity, but we're starting to pull in more of that business information to apply to risk. So not only am I seeing something suspicious, but should I even care about it? And so what I talk a lot about is moving from those billions of threats that are out there to the 10, 20, 30 things that I, as a SOC manager, need to address right now, and then have that list continually updated. That becomes a risk-informed defense strategy, again, that's bringing in the business into the conversation.
Going back to Mark Casetta, I think the entire world has seen a lot of changes over the last 2 years, 2.5 years with remote work. So how has that impacted cybersecurity practices at organizations?
I think they all got a test very quickly. I sort of highlight that, you know, when that switch happened, everybody got their zero trust exam in about a week and figured out whether they passed or failed. And then I would say a large percentage of the market struggled through that exam and had a very short period of time to figure out how to fix that problem. And I kind of look at it as, we think of it through sort of like the technology adoption curve. The last, I would say 2020 was kind of like there's a lot of early adopters and innovators. And then 2021, a lot of organizations sort of entered that chasm, right? Where they're sort of in this place of like, okay, I just deployed a whole bunch of technology. What's working? What's not working? Am I actually even more secure? I've got everybody all over the world working remotely. I think that's okay, but you know, what are my big gaps? And so what do I do next? And so what we started to see more in 22, and I have this conversation with customers all the time, it's, as they're talking to us about a strategy, about what they're trying to do, I ask the question, well, how are you aligning this? What's the goal? And I would say 90% of the time it's lining up to a zero trust strategy. And we've talked about that word, and yes, I know it's been around for a long time, but that's absolutely what's happening right now, is a response to trying to kind of get some clarity to what the next investments what the right investments they need to make in their cybersecurity program, as they've sort of come out of this, I would say, chaos over the last couple of years. So I don't know if that answers the question at sort of a tactical level, but that's kind of what I believe I've seen more from a cybersecurity point of view.
Basically, I like that people got a zero trust lesson pretty quickly, which they did. I think that the part that still amazes me, though, is we have been discussing this for well before COVID. And maybe it's just because lately I've had some Gartner inquiries and conversations with customers, and one that's like, we love SMS OTP. And I'm like, well, we banned that in 2016, So that's the other part I think a lot of folks aren't realizing, is how behind organizations are and continue to be. And in terms of prioritization of security, the remote workforce and COVID, like I said, exploded that. But the conversation of moving to cloud and having to figure out how to secure something outside of four walls has been a conversation for years. So I echo what Mark says. I think it threw a wrench in people's, roadmaps and strategies. The one thing I haven't seen, though, is the conversation hasn't wildly changed, believe it or not. They're concerned about it, but I'm still talking to accounts that are cleaning up AD, right? Cleaning up thousands of abandoned AD accounts. So I think we got a lesson in it. I think people are somewhat more focused on things like cyber insurance and protecting themselves when it happens, and missing the point that there's a lot of controls that have been out there and have been proven to prevent these things. So again, I wish, a little bit of my side hustle of, I wish we were slightly more ahead of the curve than we currently are. And COVID pointed out essentially exactly that, that we aren't as far as we think we are.
So given all this context, right, we've talked about zero trust, we've talked about remote work, we've talked about all the changes that have happened. How do you think organizations should approach attack detection? What is the requirement for a next-gen SIEM or a security analytics platform or a solution? And how do you actually deploy this on the cloud? What do you think about this?
We used to show them thousands of vulnerabilities. And the answer always was, we don't have the resources to go plug all those holes. So what do you want us to do? This is the resource constraint is the one thing. I'm not a SIEM expert by any means. But I'll speak to that I think that, Mark, your point was more of like prioritization, right? Like, what's the priority things to fix and focus on? From a practical standpoint, I think vendors, consultants, we need to help these organizations know what to work on and prioritize.
Yeah, I think one of the key things, and Wayne, I'm going to reach out to you after this session, is visibility. I think, as we talk about next-gen SIEMs, one of the benefits of moving next-gen SIEM, I love next-gen as a term, it's like zero trust, but next-gen SIEM, you're moving it to the cloud. So you have the compute power to actually run the rule sets that you need to run on a large amount of data. I think where we need to take next gen SIEM is to more of the visibility. Part of the problem with SIEM is it's you have to store a lot of data, and so if I'm bringing in all of the data from Wayne's devices, that's going to become very expensive. But who's to say there's not good evidence of an attack within that data that's coming in from those IoT devices? So I think that having the visibility into your entire IT stack, so that includes everything from the endpoint, from in the cloud, all of your enterprise devices, and being able to tie together the movement of attacks across all of those particular assets.
Yeah, I mean, I would, I think this is good. We're talking a lot on the IT side, but I also represent the OT side, where when you look at the attack surface and the capabilities that you have there it's extremely difficult. I can just reference the 2016 from the Department of Defense. They had 10 million IT assets, but 2.6 billion OT assets, all of which were running 90,000 different operating systems. So getting visibility and clarity into that kind of disparate systems is the challenge that we're all faced with today. So it's challenging.
I would add just really quickly to the OT, the suppliers, so third-party risk as well. One of the things that we saw in the pandemic, and obviously this was suppliers were always people that were out there, but we saw more supplier connections to core systems, whether it was an IT system or an OT system. So how do you manage risk across organizations that you actually don't have control over is a very difficult problem.
I would answer, most people are answering with a 1,500 question questionnaire once a year.
Right. That's exactly.
We wonder why there's a problem, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And even on that part, it's one of my pet peeves because all of the questionnaires I get, of course, are skewed for IT. I'm running Windows, Linux, VM, whatever, right? But you get onto this side and it's like, so I've asked, the challenge I do when I talk to customers is I go, great, you have to have this IT security baseline and all this stuff, but you need to develop a IoT or an OT baseline that's different, that works with those kinds of devices. Otherwise, you're not really doing yourself a service. You're going to get a bunch of weird answers back, and okay, then what, right? So,
in addition, I want to also mention the part of the development side of the process. Like today, when developers using cloud environment, the benefit of cloud environment is to have a dynamic environment that developers can create different types of workloads, and we need to maintain high security standard as part of the development process. So we want a solution that can integrate with this process and to allow the developers to develop fast and at scale.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, when I talk to a lot of organizations, and ours included, is R&D spinning up all of these other different instances that you may not know about, that all the control sets aren't applied there, right? So it's a challenge.
And it may not even be R&D, unfortunately. It may be somebody else, less official than R&D. And I think the undermanaged asset problem is a huge one. You're seeing a lot of attack surface solutions, pop up. Again, I think the key thing there, and this has kind of been my mantra, is it's not enough to have a security control in place or an assessment mechanism like attack surface in place if it's not contributing to the full data store that you can use to analyze and give you the full picture of the threat and your protection against the threat.
Now, thus far, we have spoken about attack detection. We have spoken about IAM and having the right policies in place. But what about mitigation? What about remediation? What about incident response? Does anyone on the panel want to take this? How do we exactly do this in this day and age? It's extremely critical.
Yeah. Sorry, David, go ahead.
So we want an automated solution. So automation is a crucial part of a security tool today, as we want to support or not to slow the development team. And we want the solution to be context aware. We want to understand how the application behaves, and help the remediation or do the remediation without breaking any flows in the application. So context aware is very, very important in order to remediate.
Yeah, I was going to say automation. I think that as we better, and the way I look at threat detection is that you can have a threat which is kind of your mainstay threat that's been out there, or a type of attack or tactic or technique which has a signature associated with it. And the good hygiene is to make sure that you're protecting yourself against that threat on a real-time basis. That's just something that everybody should be doing. But when it comes to actual remediation and mitigation, number one, from a mitigation standpoint, automate the process of getting mitigation strategies in front of the people that can actually make the change. So getting the information directly from I've detected a threat to pushing out through your ticketing system, through whatever sort of SOAR you might have in place, to that security engineer that can very quickly mitigate the threat. From a response standpoint, It's what are the tools that are available to me as part of an ecosystem to respond to a threat. Is my SIEM plugged into some sort of an isolation tool, whether it's a segmentation tool or a networking tool, or even an endpoint isolation tool? But making sure that all these systems from the detection point to the response point are talking to those security controls is hugely important.
And Mark, Ram, I don't know if I'm allowed to ask questions, but I've got a question for Mark anyway. What you described, I know, I don't know if call it maybe the promised land or like this great idea of security orchestration, automation response. We saw that, maybe that was RSA 2016 or 2017.
Yeah.
And it kind of, those solutions, many of them got acquired or sort of baked into the platforms now. Is that orchestration, is it actually happening? Like, are people realizing that? Because I've heard mixed reviews. I've heard it's like, yeah, it's a great idea, but like still wasn't friendly enough to truly scale across the enterprise.
Yeah, I think I was at Black Hat and I saw a T-shirt from a vendor, and I forget who the vendor was, but I love it. It was "Chaos is not a playbook." was what the T-shirt said, and I think that's what it is. Is that again? You can have a SOAR in place. You can define the playbooks, and so many of them have very fantastic out-of-the-box playbooks. Oftentimes, those playbooks are directly tied to intelligence. So whatever an attacker is doing, you can turn it into a playbook to remediate and respond. But the amount of activity on the attacker side is overwhelming. And so you're always going to have making sure that you have the hygiene to protect against those pretty routine attacks. You're always going to have your, Log4js that we had at this time last year, which all of a sudden, increases the attack surface, changes the whole threat landscape. I think that's where having in place orchestration to deal with things that we already know about, and having the right security controls in place and policies in place allows you to then orchestrate those unknowns. And that's the key there. And too often, I see organizations that are using those playbooks to handle the routine. They haven't figured out how to handle the routine, and that's where they're spending all their time. It's just handling day-to-day attacks as opposed to focusing on those unique attacks.
I think too, one of the challenges is that, yes, SOAR as a technology and automating is great, but I think one of the things it doesn't account for is when you look at your tabletop exercise is the board and the risk management is saying, hey, we may have had some data leaked here. Now we got to slow down. We may have to do some, disclosure to regulatory or whatever. And that tends to bog down the speed, even though you're in a real environment. But hey, wait a second. How are we communicating this? What's our comm plan? I think those are the tricky things of if we have to go to the board and they have to have sign off on this before this, it really can bog down what's happening right at the time.
Yeah, I like, Wayne, that was what I was thinking, like the human response strategy and plan and involvement. The other thing I would say for any board level, C-level thinking about cyber investment, I was talking to our managing director from EMEA this morning, and he made a great point, which is we invest 1% into our cybersecurity of, the total budget. And these bad guys, it's their full-time revenue generation in business. And so, all too often I hear CISOs, CIOs that I talk to get cyber funding once the problems happen.
Yeah.
And that, we could talk about response and you need to practice. That's the other thing, practice. It's going to happen. Please practice. Like healthcare, you should know how to chart on paper, these type of backups. But also trying to evangelize cyber and the importance of it well before those things happen, I think is a challenge. And I'd encourage anybody that's not in IT to meet the IT people halfway, right? IT people in general and professionals, I should say, are not well-versed in business soft skills, aren't well-versed in going to the board and saying, no, I need this from you. This is why I need it. This is the business case, right? That's just not something that necessarily is part of their DNA. And so meet them halfway. It's everybody's responsibility. And people do need to start practicing for, just like we do for hurricanes or natural disasters. You need to start practicing when these things happen.
Yeah, Kimberly, I would add to that, any board deck that has the number of vulnerabilities that have been patched over a certain period, you've lost that board session for sure.
Yeah.
I think having a focus on the effectiveness, the efficacy of security. We have a customer of ours who's done a very fantastic job in answering the question, not how much did a particular breach impact my business in a monetary sense, but how much did the investment that I've made in security protect against an attack that should have happened but didn't happen. They know it should have happened because they have enough information on the reconnaissance of the attack, of the potential attack, and they could see where it was blocked. That resonates. How did I prevent something from happening which would have had an impact on our stock? And that's where your investment in security is actually going.
A lot of this is easier said than done, though, isn't it? Because when we talk about security, it's a culture thing. And people who are not in IT, they have their core functions to worry about. So that's the last thing on their minds, unfortunately. So how do you make this so ingrained in culture? I think that's probably the hardest thing to do, but how do you do it?
Go ahead, David.
So I think it's part of the idea that eventually security is a business enabler. So the developers need to understand that if they are developing a secured code, the better the business can progress. And if there's a breach or some kind of risk on the sensitive data, this can affect eventually the organization or the entire business. So they should have in mind that business is not a blocker. This is security is not a blocker. This is a business enabler, and it should come from all levels.
Yeah, I think just building on David's comment, I'm going to use a word that I don't actually like to use in the context of an organization called, but in this context, I think it's very true. It's called empowerment. And the reason why, if you want to know why I don't want to use that word, check out a blog by Patty McCord. Really, really interesting. Anyways, that aside, what we say with empowerment is we're trying to imply that the business or IT or the stakeholders around security, they need to know they have the power to actually be a part of the security solution. If we talk about this capacity problem in security, well, it's a capacity problem because we create these islands where we're not actually enabling or empowering people. We're giving people the power to make change in the organization. And so I think what's really exciting in, going back to the comment about the last couple of years, naturally what's happened is it's forced the business to start converging security, identity, and application development and innovation because they realize how tightly coupled these things actually have to be if they want to be successful. Now, have people figured out the formula? I don't think people have figured out the formula, but I believe at the center of it is an intentional move by security to drive more empowerment in the organization to be part of the solution and really almost, I'm not going to say crowdsource security, that sounds a bit odd, but get other people involved as more directly involved to be a part of the team.
Yeah, and I've given a talk in the past. I've run marketing and product marketing, and unfortunately, this is an area where IT has to start getting into marketing best practices. So understanding the persona, understanding the person, understanding why they would care. For example, having worked in healthcare IAM, clinicians don't care about anything else but treating their patient effectively, and hence why they, write their passwords on the wall next to the shared workstation or hot glue their readers, their cards into the readers that they have to use to access things. Because they ultimately, you go to them and you communicate to them about being cyber aware and being cyber secure and preventing hacks. And it doesn't resonate when you say that it's going to impact patient lives and you no longer will be able to access their chart to figure out what they're allergic to before you treat them for a massive reaction, the care. So again, I think that's the people part of security is sometimes the hardest, that change management. And I say you have to know your audience, just like any good campaign. And the best security that I've seen rolled out is when that's effectively communicated about why it matters to that person. Why is it important to that person? So that you have to go back to people in my opinion, when you roll out security.
So I want to add on this, and with an organization that I was consulting to, they had a very good culture where the security teams were sitting with the developers, and together they heard the pain of the developers in applying the security standards, and they found a way in the middle how they can maintain high security standards and allow the developers to develop fast and not block them. So working together have a better benefit eventually.
Great.
Hi, Jonathan here. Excellent panel so far. Thank you, all of you, for the wonderful insight and expertise you've given over the last 57 minutes or so. In our final 3 minutes, I would love to get everyone some final thoughts. If you have a solution you'd like to promote, a blog you want to share, anything that you want to share with our audience. 30 seconds. Floor is yours. Ram, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so I work for a company called Manage Engine. We make a unified and integrated SIEM solution called Log 360, which has cloud security as well as data loss prevention capabilities. We try and get visibility into every nook and corner of the network, and alert the security analysts and also respond to those threats. We have a blog called Manage Engine Expert Talks for anyone who wants to see. We take a look at everything that's happening in the world of security. We write about it. We create videos. So I would really encourage you guys to check that out. Thanks so much.
And Wayne.
Yeah, go to access.com. We manufacture, cameras, access control equipment, audio equipment, but access.com/cybersecurity is all of our resources. You can learn more about what we're doing to protect all of these resources or all of these assets that we develop that may end up on your network and platforms to manage lifecycle management for it. So go there, and love to follow up if you have any questions after.
Thank you. Kimberly.
Sure, yeah. So biokey.com, bio-key.com. You'll find our blog there. We blog every other week about some of these key topics. We're providing identity and access management, the full suite, multi-factor authentication, single sign-on, self-service password reset, but also uniquely integrating identity-bound biometrics, which are authentication methods that can actually verify the person behind the screen. So encourage anybody that's interested to reach out to me personally or go to biokey.com.
Thank you. Mark Alba.
Yeah, so the Anomaly platform is focused on providing visibility to SOC analysts that takes intelligence from global sources to really quickly detect and automate the response to particular threats, all while taking in that risk-informed focus to make sure that you're prioritizing how to respond to a threat. So check out anomaly.com. We do have a blog. We also have a lot of very real information that security analysts can use, including incidents of compromise, tactics and techniques of attackers, updates on rapid response with different sorts of attacks that may be occurring at any given time that we publish out to the community so that you can use those to rapidly respond to any threats.
Excellent. Thank you. David.
So many of the topics that we talked today is part of what we do in Solvo. So Solvo is the first context application-aware security tool. We prioritize risks or misconfiguration by the impact on the environment and automate the right configuration based on the behavior of the application. If you want to hear more, go to solvo.cloud and register for a trial.
Okay, thank you. And last but not least, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So Axiomatics.com to learn a bit more about us. We're on a mission to create a movement and help organizations go from an isolated authorization strategy to an orchestrated authorization strategy as they look to achieve an overall zero trust for access solution in the organization. So thank you for the time today.
You are very welcome. Thank you all for joining us. That does it for this topic. If you're watching live, please stick around. We'll be right back to the OSEC panel, Data Security, Why It's the New Killer Application in Cybersecurity. Once again, for Solutions Review, my name is Jonathan Paula. Thank you again to our panelists, and thank you for watching. Have a great day.